calls are mounting for President Cyril Ramaphosa to end the coronavirus-induced national state of disaster, which has been in place since March 2022. Some experts argue that regulations were needed to avoid chaos at the start of the pandemic, but restrictions now need to be loosened up to help rebuild the battered economy. We're joined tonight by the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation, Professor Musa Moshabela, and the head of the Solidarity Research Institute, Connie Mulder. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen, and thanks for your time. So let's begin. I suppose the question here is about the rationality of having this State of Disaster Act still in play, even though there are many scientists who believe that, you know, we're at a point where the numbers in as far as COVID-19 have been contained. Let's perhaps start with a more scientific perspective. Professor Moshabela, let me come to you.
Yes, greetings, Kathy. I think that it is an important question, and I think that from the perspective of the pandemic, we have seen so much progress with the 4 waves that we have had, resulting in high levels of immunity in the population that also does not only include sort of short-term immunity with antibodies, but also potentially some sort of long-term immunity with the cellular immunity that can help protect us from subsequent variants. So there are these early signs that we've seen that are demonstrating that we may be getting into a stage where we can really begin to live with COVID-19. There are still other things that are not answered that have to do with, for example, how the seasonality of the surges of infections might happen later, and also in terms of potentially what kind of variants we might face, what would continue to be the coverage of vaccines going forward. There are potentially questions about immune escape with variants, but we've also had people ask questions about symptoms that result from even mild disease like long COVID symptoms. There are all of those questions that still need to be answered. But certainly from a sort of disaster perspective, there is a strong feeling that we are beginning to move into a state where we can say it's more of a normalcy state where we can live with the pandemic. So we need to consider how we can begin to normalize the institutional structures that we are using to govern how we use the pandemic.
Connie, let me get your perspective. What is the position here of the Solidarity Research Institute?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. I think we wholeheartedly agree that in March of 2020, no one would have faulted President Ramaphosa for stating we're going into a state of disaster and we need to manage this. But it's now almost 2 years later. We've had a lot of knowledge. We've been through 4 waves of COVID, and we've now seen that, especially with Omicron, our healthcare facilities are more than capable of handling a surge with very little to no restrictions on movement or on gatherings, in fact, which means the disaster has, for all intents and purposes, passed. Not saying COVID has passed. We're going to live with COVID for a long time, and we'll need to learn how to live with this illness, but that is something that humanity has done for thousands of years, is living with illnesses, having enough healthcare capacity to handle it. At the start of this, former Minister Mkhize and President Ramaphosa stated that we need to flatten the curve to ensure that healthcare is not flooded and that we don't lose more people than we should. But there was no intention that we're going to sort of get rid of COVID-19. I think it's a folly to think you're going to get rid of a virus. It doesn't work that way. What we've seen now is, if you can believe Prof. Shabir Mahdi from the University of Witwatersrand, who states that 75% of South Africans have had COVID, most likely. That means we've flattened the curve. We're now at the situation where we've managed to not have healthcare be overrun. But that means the disaster has now passed, and then we need to get out of the state of disaster and get to the endemic handling of COVID. Because all measures in this would be measuring lives against livelihoods, and we've made massive economic sacrifices the last 2 years. But we can't continue on this route. We cannot continue with the economic uncertainty of not knowing if you're going to have a job on Monday when the president speaks on Sunday night, which happened to several restaurateurs, several liquor shop owners, and even in the tourism industry, several of our members lost all income in December based on a state of disaster that gets proclaimed, or a lockdown level that gets lifted with immediate effect. Now, this is not an environment conducive to economic growth, and we're going to look at the wreckage of what actually happened economically in South Africa. We need to start getting this economy going. It's time to focus on the livelihoods now. Healthcare is clearly able to cope with what's currently going on in the healthcare space.
Professor Mshabela, there's a point that has been made that even though there could well be a need to end the state of disaster, we currently don't have the necessary legislation that would help regulate some of the precautionary measures that we have put in place, i.e. your social distancing, your wearing of masks, and that those are the regulations that need to be tightened up before the state of disaster can be lifted.
Yeah, I think whilst we mostly agree with the need to sort of work towards ending the state of disaster, I think it's important to consider what needs to be in place and also making sure that we answer the unanswered questions. I do think that the legislation that we have of the Disaster Management Act of 2002, this is the first time we have used it at a national level since 2002. We have never used it. And also globally, this is the first time we have had a pandemic in over 100 years. So no one has really been able to define at what point, what are the metrics that tells us that we are at the end of the pandemic. Even the World Health Organization has not done that. I know in South Africa we are trying to be able to figure out exactly what that is. And that does not necessarily mean that we are not seeing positive signs. We are. And I think that, for all intents and purposes, there should be a concerted effort to begin to end the state of disaster. But we don't have the legislation that's going to help us to continue to manage the pandemic. The National Health Act does not have the provisions for what we have in our regulation. The Ministry of Health cannot regulate other ministries. And so there is a bit of a complication. We could figure out how some of the other regulations can be included in other pieces of legislation. But all of these things, and that's what we would want. And we could have a plan on how we need to manage surges and so forth that might happen later, even if it's seasonal. But these things need to be answered. I think that it should not be a matter of throwing the baby out in the bathwater. And we just need to make sure that we sit down and agree on what it is that we are taking forward, what it is that we are leaving behind, and if there's a need for us to kind of introduce certain pieces of legislation or amend legislation, we need to do that.
Koni, do you accept that it's not something that can happen overnight?
Well, if we can be cheeky, all of these things happened with immediate effect without any regard to the damage that they would do. So if we have to lift it, let's do that with immediate effect. But obviously, there are complications. Regarding the state of disaster, a state of disaster needs to be enacted for a disaster. Regulations that are enacted are then meant to manage the disaster. And we should be very careful of being in a situation where the tail wags the dog. If we're saying we cannot lift the state of disaster due to the regulations that we've enacted, not even though the disaster has passed. And several of these measures would be necessary. The Department of Health specifically needs to get action plans in place for what will we do with COVID surges, because we're going to have another wave most likely in May to June. And then after that, we'll most likely see a December wave as well. Should we be having action plans for that? Obviously, we should get all of that in place. But that is something that can be done without having to extend the state of disaster indefinitely.
Sorry to come in there, Koni. On the issue of, the fact that you said effectively we are out of the state of disaster. What about the point that not even the World Health Organization at this point is saying that the worst is over in as far as COVID-19 is concerned? Is it not too high a risk to take, you think?
No, I'm with you, Kathy. I don't think we stated that COVID is going to go away. COVID is going to be with us for a long time. But the state of disaster was not enacted to get rid of an illness. It was enacted to ensure that healthcare is not overwhelmed, that we don't lose infrastructure, and that we can cope with what the illness brings. Now, what we've seen in December is quite obviously we're at that point. Healthcare was not overwhelmed at all. We had almost no regulations, no restrictions on movement, none of that. And we did not see the pressure that we saw with Delta or Beta. So we're, in that case, we're extremely lucky to have had Omicron being a milder disease. That does, however, mean we're now sitting with vast reservoirs of immunity, along with our vaccination program that needs to be sped up. We need to get more people vaccinated. And these two things together imply that the risk to healthcare is significantly lower than it was when the state of disaster was enacted. Is COVID going to go away? No, I think COVID is going to be with us for a very long time. It's going to become seasonal and cyclical and most likely an endemic disease. Do we have the capacity and the infrastructure to handle that without being in a state of disaster? Most likely, yes. At the moment, we can see that we successfully navigated the last wave. The problem with the state of disaster at the moment is there are very few regulations remaining, and we cannot use the regulations as a justification to keep the state of disaster, even though the risk of the disaster has realistically passed. We then need to get those regulations into legislation, into other institutions that are actually meant to govern South Africa according to the Constitution, and then we need to get on with life as close to normal as we possibly can. Illnesses are not something new. We need to ensure that we've got the capacity to handle COVID, should it flare up, should we have surges, and that's something that we can do in a normal situation. We do that with flu already. We've got worse flu seasons and better flu seasons, but we've got the capacity to handle that.
All right.
And that is the direction that we should be going.
Gwani Mulder, he is the head of the Solidarity Research Institute. You also heard from the University of KZN's Professor Musa Moshabela.